people already belonging to our community and all the newcomers. As many of you will know, Civitas is a forum of archives and research on Christian democracy. It was founded by the Istituto Luigi Sturzo, Rome, by the CADOC of Leuven, and by the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in St. Augustine. And it is a platform of research institutions and archives. It connects archivists and researchers who are focused on the field of research and sources on Christian democracy. Our communication language is English, of course, so we will use it in this seminar. As always, we have launched a cycle of webinars last years, and it remains a regular annual activity we do. It is devoted to discussions on recent relevant contributions to the research on Christian democracy. Sometimes it may be devoted to particular topics, like STEER, for example. We concentrated on peace and Christian democracy. I have also to tell you that our web seminars are also in direct streaming, so they may be listened to also from the websites of Civitas and from the websites of the founding members in the next days for people who will not able to stay with us today. This is the second seminar of this year. Last month, on April 15th, we had the first seminars. Fabio Bolsonar of the Japanese University of Waseda spoke about his book on Catholicism and the welfare state in secular France. And today, Pepin Corduvener, whom I warmly thank for his presence with us, will speak about the rise and fall of the People's Parties, a history of democracy in Western Europe since 1918. We will have a third seminar before summer on June 18th. Put it in your agendas. Piotr Kosicki from the University of Maryland, who is also a member of our scientific committee, and Mark Gilbert of the Johns Hopkins University will discuss a new recent book on the history of Christian democracy in Italy with the authors. After the summer, we have scheduled 2 more seminars, one with Anna von der Goltz on her book, the other 68ers, Students, Protest and Christian Democracy in West Germany, and a last seminar on Christian democracy in Latin America. You will be informed, of course, about all the dates. Well, let's come to today's seminar. The Rise and Fall of the People's Parties, A History of Democracy in Western Europe Since 1918 is the title of the book that Pepin Corduvener published with the Oxford University Press last year. He is associate professor in the section of political history at the University of Utrecht, and his main research interest is just the history of democracy in Western Europe. Before publishing The Rise and Fall of the People's Parties, in 2017, he has published another monograph, The Problem of Democracy in Post-War Europe with Routledge. And he is specialized also, and this is very important for me at least, in Italian politics and its history. He has published with Arthur Venstein a Dutch language study of Italian as Europe's political laboratory. I have to confess that this idea has always been one of the ideas I am most convinced about. That is, I think exactly this, that Italy is a laboratory for contemporary politics. Pepin Cordueneri is also working on a project that explores the consequences of the fall of the Berlin Wall for Western Europe, and has published an edited volume about this topic. He also appears regularly as an expert commentator on Italy and democracy in Europe, on Dutch and Belgian television, radio, newspapers. So, very interesting young researcher. His book has impressed us, especially for one reason. It is a fascinating case in which historical research is put at the service of a significant problem for the contemporary world, the crisis of democracy. The book looks at the center-left and the center-right people's parties of the past, which seem in great difficulty today, and tries to explain why these parties were so crucial for the stabilization and legitimization of democracy in the past, and why the crisis of these political parties contributes so deeply in today's crisis of democracies. I think there is enough to enormously raise everybody's interest here. So, this is the conclusion of my presentation. The floor is now to him.
Well, I hope you can all hear me. Thanks very much, first of all, for this very kind and generous introduction, Professor Moro. It's been too kind, all these words, and thanks also for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to engage with you all about this, I think, still very fascinating topic, the question of democracy in the 20th century. And I think I would also like to emphasize in the beginning that this, although I'm happy to give a presentation about the book that I've published in September, indeed, with OUP, it should not just be about me presenting my book, my monograph, but I hope we can also have a conversation afterwards about the question how we can explain sort of the remarkable trajectory of democracy in the past century, and also I think some of the urgent questions that are lying in front of us today, both at sort of at a societal level, but also I think for us as academics. So I'm very happy to be here, but also I'm happy that you're all here to talk about these questions together. I will try to share my screen so I can share a couple of slides with you, which are most of all for illustration. I hope this works. Does it work? Okay, excellent. Okay. Before, or sort of as a beginning to my talk, I thought it would make sense to take a step back and reflect briefly on the question, what are we actually trying to explain and study when we talk about the history of democracy in 20th century Europe? And it seems to me that the larger the questions and the urgency of democracy's problems today are, the more scholars seem to be interested in that question in the history of democracy in the 20th century. And this counts for political scientists. I think especially after Trump was elected to the White House, we have seen many publications about the death of democracy, how democracies die, how democracies end, and many publications with these kind of titles. But it also counts, I think, for historians who increasingly go back to history, especially the history of democracy, and to explain the remarkable trajectory of democracy in the 20th century. And they come up with many different explanations. I think ideology, so the democracy as the winning ideology of the age of extremes, has been a very sort of dominant perspective. There are many explanations which highlight our international geopolitical considerations, so the Cold War as an explanation for democracy in the 20th century. And there are many explanations that take more sort of socioeconomic perspective, especially the perspective of sort of coordinated capitalism as an explanation or perspective on the history of democracy. And what I believe is implicit in much scholarship on democracy is the image of a certain arch of democracy, an arch of democracy that spans the 20th century. And democracy sort of started this arch in the beginning in the 1920s, 1930s, very tentatively and troublesome. And then democracy experienced a sort of high tide in the 50s, 60s, early 70s, perhaps, or the democratic age, to speak with Martin Conway, the democratic age, the high tide of democracy. And now we're on sort of the other side of the arch and we're going down. The most recent period in the history of democracy is a period in which many of the institutions of that democratic age are still intact, but confidence in them has radically declined. So what is implicit in much of the scholarship on the history of democracy is this image of a rise and fall of democracy. I would like to return to that question about this fall of democracy in the conclusion of my talk briefly, but I think for now it's good to keep that assumption in mind, because I think it raises three analytically distinct but still related questions. Namely, what explains the problems of democracy in the interwar era, the remarkable stabilization and legitimation of democracy in the post-war era, and then the growing troubles of democracy in the final part of the 20th century. These are three sort of different questions, but they also have something in common. And this is what what I'm exploring in the book. And also because many histories are either focusing on either the interwar era or the post-war era or the most recent period. So I've been looking in the book for sort of a commonality that played a role in explaining and answering these three different questions at the same time. And this, from this perspective, that I decided to study in the book the role of political parties of a particular type, what I call the people's parties in the book, because of the many striking parallels between the history of those people's parties and the history of democracy in the 20th century. And especially here in the context in which we are today at Civitas, I think I should emphasize that I use the term people's parties here, not in a traditional Christian democratic sense of a popular party, but as I assume that you know, I use it in the German sense, the Volkspartei, the People's Party. So a center-left and center-right party, not exclusively Christian Democratic Party. I will come to my definition or understanding of that party in a second, but I think it's good also to highlight at the beginning of this talk that this book is not a sort of apology of that party, I think we should also be careful to paint too rosy or too beautiful a picture of those parties, or to be too nostalgic about those parties, because as democracy itself inevitably does, it also fell short of achieving many democratic ideals. It was a form of politics in which the ability of ordinary members to influence decision-making at the top was often limited. And for a long time, but I think even today, this People's Party was also a very particular sort of homogeneous and male form of politics. Women were often pushed to the margins of these organizations, both in the organizations, in the policies, and in the membership of those parties. Just to give a short illustration of that, as late as the 1980s, women counted for just 18% of all SPD members in Germany, 22% of CDU members, and 16% of the Parti Socialist members. And at the level of the leadership, these imbalances were even bigger. Only 1 in 5 delegates of the Gaullist Party conference in 1984 was female. And out of the 259 local CDU section presidents, only 6 were women in 1989. So just to give you an impression of the imbalance that we're talking about. Notwithstanding all these shortcomings, I try to show in the book that throughout the 20th century, the people's parties were crucial for the stabilization and legitimation of democracy. And I try to explain in the book that they did so, or they were able to do so because of 3 reasons. First of all, these people's parties did not claim to represent only specific social or confessional groups. And they did not therefore sharpen social divisions or cultural divisions and replace them on a political level. They were not exclusive in nature, but in principle, in theory, they stood open to anyone. And therefore, they claimed to represent the general interest rather than a strictly partisan interest. And they managed to integrate a very broad section of the electorate in their parties, and therefore they worked against political polarization. A second characteristic of these parties is because they stood open to anyone and claimed to go beyond particular partisan interests, they were willing to compromise and they're willing to collaborate. They were not just parties of propaganda, so to speak, that expressed only the views of their supporters on the street, but rather they were parties that were willing to take the burden of government responsibility. And this also implied a willingness to share power with competitors and see these competitors also as democratic equals and legitimate democratically, not just as sort of arch enemies. And finally, so third of all, these people's parties were deeply rooted in society. So thanks to the work of all these tireless officials and all these their own newspapers and affiliations with cultural and sports organizations and the offices they had in even the most remote parts of the country. And this was very important because they managed to legitimize democracy from below, because they involved all kind of citizens in the politics of their parties and by means of that in the politics of their country. So as such, I think that the People's Party was able to answer a crucial tension that lies in the heart of our democracies, namely the tension between representativeness on the one hand, so the need to represent, and on the other hand, the need to govern, governability. Because democracy by nature requires legitimacy from below and the articulation of different kind of interests on the level of society, representativeness, in other words. But democracy cannot endure if it's based only on that. It is a system of government which at some point should rise above representation and should provide cohesive, stable, coherent government. It requires governability. And I think the People's Parties of post-war Europe were uniquely equipped to solve this particular tension because of the balance that they had between those three characteristics that I just outlined. These parties were simultaneously representing people from below, expressing the will of people, and they governed. And it was a sort of a party type that by virtue of combining these three characteristics, of broadening their social base, practicing the politics of compromise, and enabling political participation from below, was able to solve this very difficult tension that lies at the heart of modern democracy. The balance between those three. So in the book, what I do, I give an overview of the history of the 20th century, viewed through the perspectives of these parties. And in the talk, I will follow roughly the outline of the book. So it will be an overview as a talk, a bird's eye view, if you want, a synthesis. And then in the questions, we can go perhaps into a couple of the details. First in the question, how did this particular conception of party politics, of the People's Party, emerge as the answer to the problems of democracy as they had become so obvious in the first half of the 20th century? I think we should be careful not to read history in terms of teleology, in which the People's Party emerged as a sort of inevitable answer to those questions after the Second World War. There are many other factors at place which enabled its particular rise in the 40s and 50s. And I'll go briefly into them in a minute. But at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that the People's Parties of post-war Europe did not emerge from sort of nowhere. They had a prehistory, and their qualities were articulated and debated also in the preceding decades as an answer to what perhaps was the most sort of formidable challenge of democracy as it opened up after the First World War. And the challenge that presented itself by the question, how can we sort of stabilize mass democracy if it is run by forces that par excellence articulate political divisions, namely political parties? How can we build democracy sort of safely and stably on the kind of mass political parties as they emerged out of the 19th century? And this question received urgency after the First World War, when on the European continent, mass democracy was everywhere crafted in the mold of what contemporaries already called a party state, a state which could no longer function without the collaboration of mass parties, and a state which made it also explicit in its institutional design, the electoral voting system, parliamentary orders, the rules of government formation, the design of the electoral ballot, as we can see. All these went sort of against the anti-party political culture of the 19th century and tried to make explicit after the First World War that democracy was necessarily party democracy. However, if democracy was party democracy, many leading political thinkers of the day argued that parties would need to change to make democracy work. And across the continent, in both Catholic and socialist circles, as well as among leading political thinkers, similar ideas were put forward to sketch what this required. And sometimes these thinkers and these politicians already explicitly framed this solution as the People's Party. And sometimes also by referring some of the characteristics that I just talked about. Sometimes they were very well-known names. Of course, Sturzo was one of them, or Hjalmar Branting in Sweden was another one, who in their own way and with different degrees of success promoted this party type, conceptualizing their constituency and the role of the parties differently than before, talking about the need to go beyond a specifically well-defined confessional or working class group, but representing the people as a whole, and emphasizing the importance of collaboration with opposing groups and striking compromises as a necessary element of democracy. But as I try to show in the book, there were also lesser known people with a similar agenda. Francis Gay in France with the Christian Democrat movement over there, or the Christian trade union leader in Germany, Adam Stegerwald, and the socialist politician Wilhelm Solman in Germany, who argued for collaboration between socialists and Catholics over there, embracing governmental responsibility and the broadening of the base of their parties over there. They consistently went against the grain of the common opinion in their parties by pointing to the consequences of party political polarization. And Stegerwald argued in the 1920s already that we must aim for the stabilization of our party system. And such a stabilization is only possible by means of a moderate party which has a broad basis among voters. The specific aim of such a party should be to bring voters together. So if such ideals were articulated against the problems of interwar democracy across Europe, why did this ideal of the People's Party fail to get such a broad adherence? Why did mass parties fail to transform into people's parties in the 1920s, 1930s? The answer was often given already by contemporary politicians and observers. And there was, if you study the sources at the time, a striking agreement among them about why this failure to transform into people's parties. And it might make sense to briefly follow Wilhelm Solman's views here, as he was representative of the views of many. And he was convinced that it was the legacy of the SPD's anti-system identity, crafted carefully during the German Empire and its opposition against the German Empire, which impeded the transformation of the SPD from a mass into a people's party. The party had always built its identity on refuting and refusing the economic and political order of the country before 1914, and according to Solman, had never taken on any government responsibility. And he argued that for Weimar democracy to succeed, it was essential that the SPD would overcome this sort of anti-system legacy. He argued that we should push back all the doubts about the value of democracy among the working class by taking government responsibility. And he sharply criticized those who, in working class circles, preferred to vote for a party whose members promised not to hold office until their death. And he said, instead, the party should be ready to enter coalitions that serve democratic and social progress. So in other words, he said, we have to break with our own traditions of a mass party, and we should become what he called a social democratic people's party. Well, his analysis, of course, counted for the SPD, but it's not difficult to see that it applied much more widely. The legacy of the founding of parties in the 19th century in many places impeded transformation of confessional and socialist parties into people's parties after the First World War. These parties were antagonists, but I think they also resembled each other in a way that they all claimed to defend specific often marginalized groups. And they did not share government responsibility very widely before 1914, and they harbored a certain ambiguity towards parliamentary institutions. they all had a sort of an anti-system identity. But despite the fact that these post-war reforms, institutionalized party democracy, the parties themselves did not reform in an equal way. In the words of the German thinker Hugo Preuss, he said that the parties failed to understand the consequences of their own reforms, and democracy cannot be governed if parties do not give unconditional priority to the general interest, rather than being there for their own sake. However, partly because of the inability of parties to break with this legacy of being there for their own sake, the large European democracies increasingly seemed to enter a vicious circle in the 1920s and 1930s. Ideological traditions and social divisions fueled polarization, and polarization fueled government instability, and this fed dissatisfaction with party politics and parliamentary government. And feared by the consequence of searching for compromise, the mass parties defined their own role more narrowly, representing their core supporters in order not to alienate them further, and this further dented the prospect of governmental stability and raised the cost of compromise even higher. And in the face of this, the model of the People's Party, as it was advocated by people like Solman, lost their appeal, and other conceptions of mass politics seemed to have much better prospects in the 1930s. Of course, the prospect of the mass party with a strong working class character, and of the authoritarian model of the People's Party, and the other, which also in its own way played upon the vocabulary of the people. However, I think below the surface of dictatorship and occupation, and very much defined against it, the democratic model of the People's Party continued to be articulated in the 1930s and early 1940s as a solution to democracy's interwar problems. This counted, for instance, of people like Hendrik de Man in Belgium. He was a first-hand witness to the rise of Nazism in Germany, and he warned his colleagues in the Belgian Socialist Party of the ability of fascist parties to attract middle-class and working-class voters. And he argued, therefore, the Socialist Party should become a people's party, reaching out in collaboration also with Catholics in the middle class. And the same kind of conclusion was drawn by many other politicians of different political traditions who spent years in hiding, prison, or exile. And their experiences were opportunities for reflection of why democracy had failed. And it brought them closer to one another in their appreciation and understanding of democracy, a parliamentary democracy, as an intrinsic value, rather than an instrumental one that allowed their parties to maximize their support, and also of collaboration with other parties as an essential element of it. Indeed, many leading politicians concluded that more than economic instability or the hyperinflation or geopolitics was the absence of broad-based people's parties that had caused the polarization of interwar democracy. Indeed, as the Italian socialist leader Filippo Turati observed from his Paris exile, he said, "It would be wrong to deny fascism this merit. It has brought millions of hearts and brains together who believed that they were enemies." For that reason, the end of the 1930s and early 1940s were a transformative, I think, crucial period. Interwar politics were a lasting warning about what could be the fatal consequence when parties were only there for their own sake. And it brought about a fundamental rethinking of the place and purpose of political party in democracy. Already in 1942, a group of Italian Catholics, of course, founded the Democrazia Cristiana with precisely this ambition to be a party for all Italians in all its categories, and to become a party for government. There's no longer a force of division or anti-system, but a party for collaboration, openness, responsibility. And a party in a way that superseded the implication of partisanship. The same spirit was visible in the early documents of the CDU in Germany, and of course of the MRP in France as well as the refounding of Catholic parties in the Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and in Austria. Austrian People's Party, the Catholic People's Party, Christian People's Party. And it was no coincidence that the new Christian Democrats, I think, in Germany, France, and Italy, all omitted the use the word party from their own name. And transition period between about 1943 and 1948-49, the model of the People's Party came to surface as the hegemonic party model, crucial for the stabilization of democracy, electorally, institutionally, and ideologically. And one dimension, of course, influenced the other. It was the electoral strength of the People's Party, which allowed them to enact their own People's Party conception into post-war constitutions, highlighting the value of the People's Party also for the functioning of democracy as such. And the clearest, or perhaps best example of that is the post-war constitution of the state of Baden in Germany 1947, which obliged parties to take responsibility for the formation of political life and the guidance of the state, whether they are in government or in opposition, and to place the interest of the state before that of the party. This was a clear indication of how the idea of the People's Party as a model, as an ideal, found its way into post-war constitutions. In other words, the constitution obliged parties to be people's parties. But constitutional reform was no prerequisite of democracy's transformation. I think the transformation of parties themselves was in the end much more important. Because look at Austria. It adopted the same constitution after the Second World War as it had after the First World War. Well, the First World War, this document had been the backdrop of growing polarization and ultimately a very brief but a harsh civil war between confessionals and socialists. But now the same document provided the blueprint of decades of stability and collaboration, and it was because the parties changed, not the constitution changed. I think part of the reasons for the hegemony of the people's parties was due to external reasons. Of course, the war delegitimized radical and authoritarian alternatives to the right, while the coming Cold War did so on the political left. And of course, we cannot underestimate the importance of the Allied intervention. But I think also part of the hegemony of the people's parties was also indigenous in a way. It came from themselves, because their conception of party politics possessed certain qualities that fitted very well the spirit of the age. It was in tune with a search for normality after 2 decades of heated political divisions and polarization. It captured a need for cross-class and cross-confessional collaborations. As the CDU formulated after the war, this was a party in which all sections of the people stand together. It is no longer a party in the old sense of the word. It was a party that overcame partisanship. That was the idea of the People's Party. So paradoxically, I think, the search for consensus, for normality, for collaboration, for compromise, rather than any sort of aspiration for revolution, was the main legacy of the war. Indeed, the Danish political scientist Alf Ross published this pamphlet in 1946, translated in 5 languages. He observed in 1946 that in a democracy, the winner-takes-all principle on the conflict of interest, identity, and economy does not apply, because the price of victory is the destruction of democracy. Parties should work constantly for the integration of various groups and their conceptions of right and justice. So collaboration and compromise and consensus, this is what democracy was all about, no longer about winning elections and mobilizing your support base. This is a radically different kind of conception of democracy than in the 1920s and 1930s. And this sort of new spirit of democracy required a rethinking of the function of parties in a democracy. What role should they play in order to make democracy work? Certainly not the role that most parties played in the 1920s and 1930s, maximizing their support, rallying their constituents, their support, and then take power on the winner-takes-all principle. No, democracy required collaboration, compromise, and consensus. And all people's parties, you can see that they take initiatives in this regard. Christian Democrats, they reached out to workers to the extent that one French Christian Democrats said, our missionary lands are made up of proletarians, so they really go out into working class circles. Of course, the initiatives to reach out to peasants and small landowners of Christian Democrats are well known. The CDU even had the idea of, or they initiated the idea of Proporzprotestanten, so a quite number of Protestants to feature on party boards. The Dutch Catholic Party, for the first time, formally allowed non-Catholics to join the party. So you can see all kind of initiatives to convey this image that parties were there for collaboration, openness, and compromise. And the success of the Christian Democrats, because they were the pioneers in this regard, was in the 1950s emulated by the socialists and imitated by the socialists, and also, I would argue, by the Gaullists from the end of the 1950s onwards. And also for them, this motivation to stabilize and legitimize democracy from in this same spirit formed a central conception or element of their transition from mass parties into people's parties. They came to identify democracy as people's party democracy. The SPD no longer campaigned against with a sort of party program of opposition, but they campaigned with the slogan, yes to the SPD, yes to Germany now. And after having consolidated the Fifth Republic, also the Gaullist movement moved in this same direction of emphasizing government responsibility and the general interest, just like the Christian Democrats had done before. So in the 1960s, it was a Swedish political scientist and journalist, Herbert Tingsten, who observed the emergence of democracy as what he called a super ideology, something literally that was above or beyond ideology. And he noted that the stress on shared values means that ideologies are so reduced in significance that one can speak of the development of politics into administration. So the convergence of these major political parties to this People's Party model meant that there were no longer any sort of fundamental differences which distinguished center-left and center-right political parties. With this emphasis on stability and compromise, this administration or governing of democracy became a major preoccupation of the people's parties. Post-war democracy has been characterized as a system in which power drifts away from the political center, shared and divided over many different kinds of institutions, such as courts, economic advisory councils, planning agencies, corporate institutions, etc. But precisely this sort of fragmentation of power required a very strong sense of coordination. This is what the people's parties in their heyday, in their high tide, were able to provide. And they and their leading politicians became the dots that connected all these different kind of institutions and made sure that consensus was made on a political level and translated also into society. I think about institutions like the Coldiretti in Italy, the way that the language conflicts were managed in Belgium, and how the leaders of the Austrian Socialist and Catholic parties staffed the sort of social partnership there with the chambers of labor and commerce and agriculture, which dominated social and economic policy, or even places like Germany, where the Federal Constitutional Court or the Central Bank were staffed with members of the leading people's parties. And politicians were not so concerned with the ethical side of this, but they saw it as a fundamental way to promote consensus and stability, and said this is what we needed after referring to the interwar era as a learning experience. This is what you get when we see the Austrian Chancellor Alfons Gorbach presenting his Grand Coalition, a socialist Catholic government, in Parliament in 1961, where he could count on all but 8 seats. And when he said in the 1930s, patriots were no Democrats and Democrats were no patriots, but democracy can only flourish in an atmosphere of social peace. And therefore it's important that even though the socialists and Christian Democrats are separated by different worldviews, they have a shared dedication to common values and objectives. So now finally he said, Democrats are patriots and the other way around. So in the 1960s, there seemed no ideological or electoral alternative to the People's Party. It was soon exported to Spain and Portugal also when they democratized in the 1970s. There's the same model of People's Party democracy, and also quite actively exported, especially by the German People's Party, who spent resources and efforts to export their model to Portugal and especially also to Spain. But it's this moment of high tide, which is also at the same time a turning point in the 1970s. Because if there's one sort of red thread that connects the history of these People's Parties since the 1970s, it seems to me that it is the growing necessity to reform and their continuous inability to achieve that reform. Considering, I think, the time, I won't go into this too long, but that is the part that concerns the third part of the book. I think it's sufficient to say two things. First of all, the first thing would be that the parties had a great difficulty in responding organizationally to an increasingly fluid and individualized society that sought different ways of political participation. And the main initiative in this regard of the People's Parties was what they call the Open Party, which sought to break down the walls between members and non-members, or members and the rest of society. The party should become a network, a service center, as they called it. But this, in my view, only gave the impression that parties were no longer needed as a vehicle of political participation, and eroded also the party as a link between politicians and the electorate. A second observation, very quickly here, is that parties since the 1970s invested very heavily in their governing role, in their governing capacities. This is an observation that has been made quite often in political science, people like Peter Mayer, Angelo Panebianco, but also in the book, what I try to do is to give some kind of empirical foundation for it, looking at how parties represented, the discourse that they used, which also signified the same trend. They spent more energy and resources on governing and less on representing from below. So a main explanation for their decline is that they responded to the crisis of governability of the 1970s by emphasizing their governing qualities, but did not, or perhaps did not, find the right way to respond to the parallel crisis of representation. Or perhaps they aim to represent to the crisis of representation by emphasizing their governing role. So where does it leave us today? In the conclusion of the book, I make a small tour around the prestigious party headquarters of these people's parties in the 20th century. And you can see that previously they were situated in the center of political power, in the heart of capitals, in the shadows of ministries and presidential offices. You can see here with the Socialist Party in France. That is no longer the case. And the people's parties have often moved to the margin of town, in rented office building floors, or even abandoned warehouses. And this, of course, reflects their growing electoral demise, which has taken place to such an extent that it seems right to talk about the decline of the People's Party. And I think that a long-term perspective and the value of a historical approach is to help us better understand why this has been the case. And you can see that the balance between the three core elements of the People's Party, facilitating participation from below, representing broad groups, and governing from above, has become upset. And has become upset also because much, as I said, emphasis has been placed on this third element of emphasizing this governing role. I'm not sure if there's what kind of hope there is for revival of the People's Party, but I don't think to conclude that this should necessarily make us very pessimistic about the future of democracy, only this fact. Perhaps for two reasons. First, I think we should be careful with idealizing the era of the People's Party too much. Sure, this was an era of political stability, but it also came with a price. It was also, like our own age, an age where democracy fell short of achieving many democratic ideals. Most of all, I think, in terms of participation and diversity. And second of all, I think as a second kind of conclusion, I think the lesson, no People's Party, no democracy, might apply well to the 20th century, but it not necessarily would apply to the 21st century. What we witness today is perhaps not so much the crisis of democracy as such, but a crisis of a particular model of democracy, namely of People's Party democracy. And because the erosion of these parties has gone rather slowly, it is perhaps not as evident as other or previous or crises of democracy, which often came more suddenly. but the effects of it are very real. With the demise of the People's Party, democracy is moving into a new phase. And precisely the fact that we have only known People's Party democracy for so long is causing so much uncertainty in Europe, because we're not sure how post-People Party democracy will actually look like. The question, I think, is therefore not so much if democracy will survive the demise of the People's Parties, but rather how democracy will be adapted to the post-People Party era, and who will decide what a readaptation will look like. Because with the demise of the People's Party, democracy in Europe is moving to sort of uncharted territory. And we must all find new ways, organizations and institutions, to rhyme the need to express the concerns of citizens with the imperative to avoid political polarization and the necessity to provide stable government all at the same time. And this, I think, and this is where my final words, seems to be the biggest paradox of democracy today. Because it seems increasingly unimaginable that the People's Party of the last century can somehow be resurrected, but we need still some of their unique qualities to provide these kind of balances also in our own time. I think I will leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this fascinating perspective, new, I think original, very interesting. We are used to the category many political scientists use for this kind of parties is the catch-all party. And your perspective is much more comparative and much more long period oriented. So it is, I think, a very interesting alternative to the simple explanation of the triumph and decline of the catch-all parties. So I found it very, very, very interesting, but I do not want to monopolize the floor. So I would ask all the audience, all the participants, to start with comments or questions for our speaker, please. I see no raised hand. Oh, yes, here it is, please.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't intend to raise so many hands or make so much fuss on the screen.
Professor Kaiser, welcome.
Hello. Well, thank you very much for your presentation. Excellent. I'm sorry I haven't had time to read the book, even though I know it was published in September of last year, and it's definitely on my list of ebooks to read. So I'm sure you will be talking about many of the aspects that I'm going to raise now in the book, and you simply didn't have time in the presentation. But I am wondering about two things. One is whether you are not perhaps exaggerating the particularities of the people's parties. If you look, for example, and you sort of hinted at that by talking about their strategies in the post-war period, if you look at individual parties like the KVP, for example, Catholic People's Party in the Netherlands, then until the early 1960s, it organized 90% of practicing Catholics. That was basically a party of practicing Catholics, no People's Party whatsoever. If you look at the CDU, and you talked about that, it was very much dominated by Catholics and Catholic politicians, both at the level of voters and at the level of the party leadership as well. And it made a particular effort precisely to address this as an issue because it wanted to be more interconfessional and more of a people's party. Also, if you look at the voter composition of this particular case, I'm German myself, and perhaps I know this particular case better than some others. 90% of farmers voted for the CDU in Germany, not for the SPD. So you still have a very strong organization along traditional lines of the interwar and the period in even the 19th century. The Social Democrats, even after Bad Godesberg, still took time before they significantly gained voters outside of their working class base, for example. So my first question would be, to what extent was this really a question of party ideology? and a projection of a particular image as an ideal type more than the actual practice of party politics in Europe. And I think you can talk about other cases as well. For example, if you look at the MRP, I'm only talking for the moment about the Christian Democrats or Catholic People's Parties because I know them better. But if you look at the MRP, for example, it highlighted, of course, its centrist and non-confessional dimensions because it wanted to overcome the tradition of far-right organized political Catholicism in the Action Française and so on in the interwar period. But in practice, again, it was basically a party of practicing Catholics that were now less oriented for reasons perhaps to do with the past and the experience of Vichy towards the right. So this is my first question. To what extent are you talking about party ideology and objectives rather than the actual practices, everyday practices of the political parties and their internal composition? And my second question regards the question of context. I think there is a tendency now that I found in your presentation, but also in Martin Conway's book, for example, to interpret the history of democracy from within these people's parties. And I think that's very problematic. I think we need much more context. You mentioned almost in passing that things change in the 1970s. So I would like to know, why does it change in the 1970s? And I would like to know from you whether you would agree with the idea that maybe the period from the 1950s to the 1970s is exceptional in allowing these people's or self-proclaimed people's parties to rule Western Europe, the democratic Western Europe, Western European political space, essentially for two reasons, which have very little to do with them and their internal constitution. I would try to say slightly provocatively, perhaps. First point is the success of the mixed economy from the 1950s onwards, the almost permanent growth with a short dip in 1965-66 until 1973, and therefore the scope for these people's parties to redistribute and to make sure that until 1973, the West European democratic economies saw a convergence of income and wealth, which also reduced social tensions in their societies. And this changed significantly after 1973, the oil crisis and the structural problems that were then being addressed with more neoliberal, or whatever you want to call them, economic policies. But the second point, I think, is anti-communism. I mean, we're talking about the Cold War. I don't think you even mentioned once that this is a period of the Cold War. So essentially, these people's parties could all align around a particular concept of democracy, which included close collaboration with the United States, despite ideological differences of one kind or another, against the communist Soviet Union and communist political parties after 1947-48 domestically. So this very significantly strengthened the internal cohesion of these democracies. And this is a factor that completely disappeared in 1989, with, I think, also important effects on the internal constitution of European democracies. So I'm just wondering whether you could enlarge a little bit about these two contextual dimensions.
Yeah, sure. These are both excellent questions and observations, and I thank you very much for both of them. And perhaps not fruitful for the discussion, but I also tend to agree, I think, to a very large extent with both of them. I think concerning the first issue of the sort of peculiarity of these people's parties, yes, of course, what you call the internal composition or the sociology, perhaps, of those parties there was indeed a very large continuity from the 20s to the late 50s, early 60s in those political parties. But I think indeed, if you look from the level of ideology, you see a major change that I think foreshadowed or preceded what would happen sociologically with those parties in the 1960s. And there's those level of ideology that I'm interested in, because it touches upon the question how these people's parties collaborated and how they worked together. And so indeed, the example of the Dutch Catholics, they had 90% of their members of the votes were active Catholics. And in that sense, the fact that they also opened to non-Catholics was not very meaningful. So on the practical level, not very meaningful. I think sort of on an ideological level, as a message that they conveyed, that also their opponents or non-Catholics were legitimate. That was, I think, what counted. And in the 1920s, 1930s, their voting base looked very similar to after the war, to after the Second World War. But then they had the dogma of the absolute necessity. They would not collaborate with socialists unless it was absolutely necessary, which for them was only 1939. But after the war, they said, well, these are legitimate partners, and we should work together with them. And I think that was of huge significance, because see a similar kind of dynamic also in other democracies. So yeah, no, I agree. Sociologically, there did not change very much until the 60s. But ideologically on that level, this the perspective that I take in these chapters, something did change. And then I think also your second issue, this was an exceptional period. And I think the exceptionality of that period becomes even clearer today to us in the situation where democracy stands in Europe at the moment. And we are puzzled as historians. I think we should be puzzled by the question, what allowed that period of exceptional stability and legitimacy of democracy if we are confronted with some of the questions that we are confronted with today. And I think also a major task for us as historians is something that's still, for me, I think if you look at scholarship on history of democracy today, still lies strange enough somewhat beyond our horizon, which is what you indeed say, what happened in the 1970s? What happened there? This is the question I think that we have sort of almost a collective responsibility to address. And I think both your answers are very, very, very valid. What happened since and also 70s, 80s, the oil crisis, that changed the whole sort of the conditions that were there for these parties to function in the way and flourish in the way they did in the first place. That is one. And the Cold War is the other. And I do talk about the Cold War in the book. And it's, I think, the paradoxical, sometimes it tries with students, because as long as you don't mention the Cold War, sometimes they don't hardly even notice that you know. But as soon as you mention it, it explains everything. This is something that I struggle with also, because it explains everything, but also not everything in a way, so because that would be too easy in a way. And for myself, I think, talking about the future kind of research and project, I think that would be one of my agendas to dive even more deeply in the question what happened in that crucial era between, let's say, 73 and the early 80s. What happened there? There's a Tendenzwende, as they say in Germany. And also, and in the book, I can only sort of scratch the surface and saying, how did these People's Party react to what was happening? And then I have a chapter around this open party philosophy that I had, that I think, in my view, underlined some of the problems rather than they solved it. And the problem of their tendency to go into this governability modus. But I agree with you that it's not sufficient as an answer. I hope this answers some of your questions.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Thank you again. I think those were both very valid points. Yeah.
Thank you. I see the raised hand by Professor Zizic. Floors to him.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, perfectly.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation. And I was wondering, maybe if we talk about reasons for dominance of these people's parties from, let's say, mid-40s till beginning of 80s, can we maybe see these reasons in a specific class structure, or maybe, let's say, specific social structure that existed during this period of industrial capitalism? Because I think that there are some insights of German sociologist Andreas Reckwitz that this emergence of this dominance of people's parties emerged from this social structure, or better say, a balanced middle-class society in Western Europe from 1945 maybe to 1975 or the beginning of 80s. This society that was very, very, it was homogeneous, but it was very socially equal, because you had very you had this comprehensive middle class society. So there was this really balanced and distribution of wealth, of living standard, and you had this comprehensive middle class that included construction or manual worker and bank clerks and scholars. They were all inside this middle class. And if we look these social issues, these economic issues, then we can see really that decline of people parties is correlated to this class transformation of Western European societies, maybe in late 80s and after that. So how do you see this link really between this specific class and social structure of Western European societies, primarily from 1945, and the dominance of the people's parties? Because you mentioned this social peace, this importance of social peace for their hegemony, and the link, of course, between this economic class social transformation from that started with, I don't know, late 80s and after that, and the decline of people's parties. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks to you. Excellent question, excellent point of view, and I think also relates very much to how do we actually see political parties? Are they reflections or mirrors of social cleavages, or are they generating, in a way, those cleavages themselves? And I think your question also connects to a question of Professor Kaiser just before, because I think we can see sort of a paradox in a way, because these parties, on the level of ideology, they believe to, after the Second World War at least, they promised to overcome the kind of cleavages that you just sketched and the kind of class differences that you just sketched. They claim to be parties for everyone and overcoming those differences, even though in reality the social base was not there yet. And at the moment, basically, that their social base was becoming more diverse, they struggled a lot with that same message of representation for everyone, because that was the moment in the 1970s that they started to fall apart. So you can see at that moment where there's sort of the class structures that you were describing were crumbling, that these parties struggled to have an answer and express kind of common identities and interests that we could keep their parties still together. And what you can see, and what I also tried to show in the book, is that especially parties on the left were becoming much less homogeneous than they were before. You can especially see the number of university graduates in those parties expanding at the expense of blue-collar workers in that same period in 1970s and 1980s. You can see this party becoming actually less diverse at a moment when societies actually become perhaps more diverse, and that's, I think, a reason for the disconnection that you just highlighted.
Thank you. Professor Zizic, have you something to add?
No, that's my point also. Thank you for your answer.
Yes, perfect. I've seen another raised hand. Elodie Giraudier, welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. I'm sorry to ask kind of the same question as Professor Kaiser in terms of context and Cold War, because I'm working on the Christian democracy in Chile, and Cold War is very important. So I was wondering if the influence of, for example, the United States in Italy or maybe in Germany too, Western Germany, would kind of also influence domestic politics, because, for example, in Chile, it did influence in terms of polarization. There was less consensus and more polarization, and you kind of said the opposite, like in terms of more consensus. But I think it's anti-communism. It's a big, important thing during this time, and it could also explain the end of the influence of people's parties. And it's what happened in the Christian democracy in Chile. So I guess it could be another explanation to what you described before. So thank you.
Yeah, no, can you still hear me? Okay, great. Yeah, very valid point of view, and also fascinating to hear the sort of Latin American perspective here on the table, because I realize this is a very old-fashioned book in a way to look at Western Europe. No, I'm happy that you bring this this on board. Yeah, there's been a huge influence of the US on domestic politics, as I think you're well aware of, also especially in these the two countries that you mentioned, West Germany and Italy in particular. There's also a huge body of literature, which I'm sure you're familiar with, about the way the US shaped the political, well, institution, but also culture, I would say, of these two countries in particular, and also in that way, yeah, contributed to this internal cohesion of democracy in these two countries, because there was, of course, a consensus, but it was very limited in a way that the communists stood outside of that consensus, especially, of course, in Italy. There was a huge group to put outside of that consensus. And I think what I go at least to some extent into in the book is sort of the culture of anti-Marxism. That was a central element of the people's parties, the Christian Democrat people's parties in Western Europe in the 40s, 50s, and I think also early 60s, as a defining element that kept those parties together. And that I think in the absence of they lost a lot of their ideological baggage they had in the 20s and 30s, and also there was a much more consensual tone. But part of what stuck those very broad group of voters and leaders and alliances together was this glue of anti-Marxism that kept those parties together. I'm not sure that it extended all the way to 1989, because even though rhetorically it was still there, it was much less efficient as a way also to rally voters than it had been in the period after the war. And I think that my view of the influence of the end of the Cold War was much more, there was sort of a catalyst of processes that were already going on in the 70s and 80s before. The way these parties emphasized their governing capacities, the way that these parties opened up or tried to go beyond the wall of their membership base as it did before, and that's something. And when, in the perspective of the view of these leaders of the parties, the West won the Cold War, that was sort of a confirmation for them that their model of the People's Party democracy was the winning model, and that also, I think, impeded in a way a sort of perhaps more self-critical view in the 1990s of looking for trends that were perhaps already there that did not get sufficient attention in a way. So it was a catalyst in a way, the end of the Cold War.
Okay, Elodie, have you some further remarks?
Yeah, thank you. Do you think that also one of the issues is that with the end of the Cold War, there are less ideology, but more kind of bureaucratic or government party, and it's kind of part of the issue of kind of the decline of People's Party?
Oh. I think the debate on the end of ideology is as long as the debate on ideology, and I think ever since, of course, Raymond Aron and others have proclaimed the end of ideology in 1950. We've been talking about the end of ideology, but it's a very ideological debate in itself, and it's very ideological in seeing certain kind of politics as ideological, but their own kind of politics as sort of post-ideological, non-ideological. And I see you smiling, so I think we have more or less the same perspective on that. So I would certainly not say that this bureaucratic kind of approach to politics is only bureaucratic. It's a very ideological approach to politics in itself, which was dominant in the 1990s, and I think to some extent still is today, and which has been the approach to looking at certain political and economic issues since the 1990s that have and that these parties have paid an electoral price for looking at it in this particular way. So it's not less ideology. It's a different ideology. That would be my answer. Thanks for that observation.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see Professor Kaiser still with his raised hand. Probably he has something to.
If I may, if we still have enough time.
Yes, we have up to 6 o'clock, 9 minutes still.
Up to
9 minutes yet.
4, yeah. Okay, I just wanted to.
Up to 6, that will be a long, long seminar.
And 2 points, additional points, if I may. The first point regards the importance of platforms for meeting and for high intensity or much higher than before intensity of transnational exchanges. I think when it comes to explaining the ability to achieve compromise and to look for consensus, I think we really shouldn't underestimate the importance of the new European forums. I mean, starting with the Council of Europe, but particularly, of course, what is now the present-day European Union, at all levels, the intergovernmental level, which after all also brought together politicians from these people's parties, as well as the inter-parliamentary level, as well as the European Parliament level, something that I've been working on quite a lot in the last 5 to 6 years. So I agree with you. I see a lot of this search for compromise and consensus in these kinds of forums, and I would say that they also had a socialization effect, that younger generations of politicians grew more used to these forms of collaboration and consensus seeking, not just in the national, confined to the national context, where this is a learning process from previous polarization, but also in the transnational and supranational context, where it's also a learning process from the previous polarization and the war experience, I think. So if you wanted to quantify that, I think it would be really difficult. But if you compare the possibilities of exchange at the level of political parties through these institutionalized forums, from the post-war period with the interwar period with before the First World War, I think there's a phenomenal growth in exchange. And so that has facilitated, I would suggest, this kind of process that you are describing. It's just a suggestion. And my question regards your position on the sort of meta level of theorizing about political parties and democracy. Are you more, if you like, in this emerging debate, as far as I can see, on the side of those who would say we are now observing an eternal decline of democracy? There are people who argue, for example, that authoritarian or totalitarian states like China or Russia and their different forms and shapes don't face these domestic constraints, of course, in the same way as pluralistic democracies in the West, in inverted commas, that they are also apparently more efficient, I would say, at utilizing and garnering modern technologies, which of course can be used for oppression as well as for other forms of development like artificial intelligence. So this puts democracies at a competitive disadvantage increasingly, if you like, in the systemic competition. Or would you say that this question of polarization and consensus is almost something that could be described as cyclical? Do we need more polarization in order to understand, again, the importance of compromise and consensus? And in this sense, maybe also compromise and consensus, as I suggested earlier, was also a reflection of the experience of the polarization of the interwar period and the need to overcome that and prevent that from happening in the future. And now it's been 70 years, and therefore we have forgotten about this, and we are again in a period of greater polarization, and perhaps unfortunately need to experience the downsides of this form of polarization in order to understand the need for more compromise and consensus again.
Wow, that's a beautiful question. I wish we had until 6 o'clock to talk about. First, I wanted to thank you for the suggestion about this institutionalized forms at the European decision making. It's something that I had not at top of my mind. So thank you very much for that. And then about your second question, I'm not sure if I have a cyclical view of history, but I do think that there's a tension in democracy between polarization and consensus. And without any polarization, there will be no democracy because there will be no debate. But also, I think the same counts if you go for the other way. There will be all consensus. Or there would be no. If there's too much polarization, there will be run risks. I should put it that way. And the question is about how to strike the right kind of balance. And if I look at Europe now, I see that we tend much more to the polarized. And yeah, I think that is a way, in a way, reason for concern. But I'm not sure if I have a sort of cyclical view that people at some point will say, oh well, now it's getting too bad, so let's go. It's really difficult to get a genius back into the bottle with polarization. And I think if I stay close to the book, it depends a lot on sort of the capacity and the understanding of history and also the present of political leaders, and the question how they will respond if polarization, in their view, becomes too high. And I think that's one of the questions that we'll have to see in the next couple of years. So we have to look to political elites, basically, seeing how they would get that genius of polarization back into the bottle, if they want to get it back into the bottle as well. I'm not sure if that's a cyclical view, but it is a view. Yeah, it has been proven that it's possible to do so. So yeah, perhaps it's possible to do so again. I hope this somehow satisfies you as an answer.
It's not your job to satisfy me.
No, I know, but it's my job to answer your questions at least now.
Okay.
So thank you anyway. Yeah.
Yes, 3 minutes yet, and I'm sorry, but I would have a question. I would come back to the issue that Professor Kaiser raised about 1970s, the change, what kind of change. Something that has always impressed me very much is an observation about the upside down turn in the, I would say, location of the right and of the left in the 1970s. The left had always been the side of change and reform. The right had always been the side of conservation and defense of the past. In the 70s, think of Thatcher, Reagan, a new right is raising, and the new right is the side of change. So the two sides exchange totally their perspectives in the 70s. And I was wondering if, according to you, this has some influence on the role of the people's parties, because both the left form of them, socialist, and the right form of them, the conservative form of them, that is the Christian democracies, both, in a certain sense, are defensors of the past, defensors of the compromise, consensus, the welfare, what we achieved in the past. What do you think about this? You have, sorry, 1 minute.
It's a beautiful question as a final question in 1 minute. Yeah, I must say that I see your observation, and what you see, I think, especially on the left, the center left people's parties, is that they used to be indeed the force of or the articulation of progress and change, and you see them playing much more on the vocabulary of efficient government, consolidation, stability, governability. Craxi is a beautiful, I think, example of this kind of language in Italy, but there are many more examples. And this is, I think, an illustration of the way in which this balance between those three elements of the People's Party becomes more upset in the 1970s and 1980s. But I think also, as I said before, there's a lot to do for us as historians on that particular period, on the 70s and 1980s. I think there's an agenda for us as historians of democracy in a particular decade. And there's a lot of unexplored material, but topics, but also, I think, sources that are worthy of our consideration.
Okay, thank you very much. Wonderful answer for 1 minute. I thank you, all the participants. Remember, next appointment, June the 18th, with a book on Italian Christian democracy. So thank you again for everybody. I hope to see you again in June.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you.